Our story centers on a man named Arthur Harrison. He was not a public figure, a politician, or a celebrity. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. A quiet, meticulous bookkeeper in his early 40s who worked for a mid-sized accounting firm downtown. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved. A man who kept to himself, who you might exchange a brief hello with in the hallway, but knew very little about. He was a creature of habit. He left for work at the same time every morning and returned at the same time every evening. His life was a steady, predictable rhythm. But Arthur had a secret weapon against the quiet solitude of his life. He was a planner. A man who thought ahead. And in a move that would unwittingly create this incredible time capsule, Arthur had paid the rent on his modest one-bedroom apartment several years in advance. It was a significant sum of money, but it gave him peace of mind. He had secured his small corner of the world. Then one Tuesday in the fall of 1983, Arthur Harrison did not show up for work. His colleagues called his apartment, but the phone just rang and rang. Days turned into weeks. A missing persons report was filed, but with no family in the state and few close friends to press the matter, his case quickly went cold. He was just another face, another name in a city of millions. And because his rent was paid, no one from the building management had any reason to enter his apartment. Years went by. The building changed ownership, management companies came and went, and the paperwork for the prepaid unit was either lost or archived away, forgotten. Apartment 4B and its silent occupant were simply erased by clerical oversight and the passage of time, a ghost in the building's administrative machinery. Until now. For 37 years, Apartment 4B was a phantom. Then, in the year 2020, the building was sold once again. The new property management company, a modern firm that prided itself on digital efficiency, began a full audit of the building's assets and tenants. It was a standard procedure. They scanned old ledgers and digitized ancient files. That is when they found the anomaly. A unit that was listed as occupied, with rent marked as paid in full through the mid-1980s, yet had no current tenant file. No record of utility usage for decades. No contact information. It was a digital ghost in their otherwise perfect system. Confused, the building manager, a young man named Rudy, went to investigate. He checked the postbox for 4B. It was empty and clean, but the lock was stiff, as if it had not been opened in a very long time. He went up to the 4th floor. The door to 4B looked like any other, perhaps a little more faded, the brass on the doorknob a little more tarnished. He knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, flat and unanswered. He knocked again, louder this time. Only silence replied. Following protocol, he posted a 24-hour notice of entry on the door. When he returned the next day and the notice was still there, untouched, he knew he had to go in. With the building's master key in hand, he approached the lock. The key slid in, but it refused to turn. It was frozen solid. A locksmith had to be called, a man who grumbled about the age of the lock set. With a bit of oil and some expert wrangling, there was a loud grating click. The sound of tumblers turning for the first time since Ronald Reagan was in the White House. Rudy pushed the door, and it swung inward on a whisper of protest, breaking a seal of settled dust that had been undisturbed for a lifetime. The first thing that hit him was the air. It was not foul or unpleasant. It was just old. It was the scent of stale paper, dry fabric, and faint, long-expired air freshener. It was the smell of a sealed box. The apartment was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight. Rudy fumbled for a light switch on the wall. He flicked it up. Nothing happened. The electricity had been cut off decades ago. Using the flashlight on his phone, he swept a beam of bright, modern light across the room. And the world stood still. Everything was coated in a fine, uniform layer of gray dust. It was not the clumpy, disturbed dust of a neglected space, but a delicate, even blanket, like a soft gray snow that had fallen and never melted. It covered a sofa with a floral pattern, a wooden coffee table, and a large boxy television set that sat in a particle board entertainment center. The dust had softened every edge, muted every color, turning the entire room into a monochrome photograph of a forgotten moment. On the coffee table, a television guide was open to the second week of October, 1983. Beside it sat a mug with a dark brown residue at the bottom, the ghost of a last cup of coffee. A copy of the Chicago Tribune lay folded neatly, its headline, now barely legible under the dust, speaking of events long consigned to history books. This was not a scene of chaos. It was the opposite. It was a scene of eerie, deliberate order. The magazines on a side table were in a neat stack, perfectly aligned. The remote control for the television, a chunky device connected by a long wire, was placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the coffee table. On a set of shelves against the far wall stood an Atari 2600, its iconic joysticks resting on either side as if waiting for a game to be played. A small collection of VHS tapes was stacked beside it. The titles were a map of the era's blockbusters: The Extraterrestrial, Raiders of the Lost Arkansas, Poltergeist. It was clear that Arthur Harrison was a man who valued neatness. He was a man who put things back in their proper place. This quiet, orderly scene made his sudden, permanent absence feel all the more jarring. It was as if he had simply evaporated in the middle of a perfectly normal evening. He had not packed a bag. He had not tidied up for a long departure. He had just stopped. Stepping further into the apartment, Rudy moved from the living room towards a small galley kitchen. The floor was covered in pale yellow linoleum, now dulled by its 37-year-old layer of dust. The appliances were relics of a different design era. A refrigerator, in a shade of avocado green that was once the height of fashion, hummed with a deep, final silence. Its door was sealed shut not by a lock, but by the hardened, ancient rubber of its gasket. With a determined pull, Rudy broke the seal. He was prepared for a terrible odor, but there was none. The air that escaped was just cold and dry. Inside, a science experiment in extreme preservation had been conducted. A carton of milk had collapsed into a brittle, chalky husk. A wedge of cheese in plastic wrap had become a hard, amber-colored rock. In the freezer, a row of Swanson TV dinners sat in their cardboard boxes, their colorful pictures of Salisbury steak and fried chicken promising a convenient meal that was never eaten. On the counter, a box of cereal, Cheerios, stood next to a sealed glass jar of Tang. But the most telling object was tacked to the wall next to the phone. It was a promotional calendar from a local insurance agent.
For the year 1983.
Each day of January, February, all the way through September, had been crossed out with a neat, black X. In the grid for October, the same methodical XS marked the passing of time. The last X was on Tuesday, October 11th. Wednesday, October 12th, was a clean, empty square. This was it. This was the day time stopped in apartment 4B. A door off the small hallway led to the bedroom. If the living room was the public face of Arthur Harrison, this was his inner sanctum. And it was here that the sense of order became almost unnerving. The bed, covered by a simple brown comforter, was made with military precision. The corners were tucked in perfectly, the single pillow fluffed and centered. There was not a wrinkle to be seen, save for the gentle settling of the dust. It looked as if he had woken up, gone through his morning routine, and prepared the room for his return in the evening. Inside the closet, his life was arranged with the same precision. A row of suits, mostly in conservative shades of gray and blue, hung perfectly spaced. His shirts were grouped by color, a gradient from white to pale blue. On a shelf above, a collection of sweaters was folded into perfect, identical rectangles. On the floor, a line of shoes, all freshly polished, stood at attention. There were work shoes, casual loafers, and a pair of running sneakers that looked almost new. This was not the closet of a man in turmoil. It was not the closet of someone planning a hasty departure. It was the closet of a man who believed in structure, in routine, in the predictable rhythm of his own life. But it was the small, simple items on the nightstand that truly stopped Rudy in his tracks. Next to a bulky digital alarm clock that was frozen with no display, lay a paperback book, face down, as if its reader had just set it aside. The page was held open by the book's own weight, a silent bookmark. And next to the book, placed neatly beside each other, were two items:
Arthur Harrison's wallet.
And his keys. Rudy, using a pen from his pocket to avoid disturbing anything, carefully nudged the wallet open. Inside was Arthur's driver's license, his face a younger, unsmiling black and white photo. There were about $40 in cash, a library card, and a few business cards. Next to it lay a simple keychain with two keys. One for the apartment's front door, the other likely for his car. This discovery changed everything. The story that had begun to form in Rudy's mind, of a man who decided to walk away and start a new life, suddenly crumbled. You might leave your coffee cup. You might leave the television on. But you do not walk out the front door to start a new life and leave your wallet and keys behind. He had not just walked out the door. The evidence suggested he had never even made it to the door. He had vanished from somewhere between making his bed and grabbing the very items he would need to face the day. The weight of that discovery, the wallet and the keys, hung in the dusty air. It was the pivot point of the entire story. A man who prepares to leave takes those items. They are the essential tools for navigating the outside world. To find them left behind on a nightstand is to find a story that has been violently ripped in half, the second part of the sentence never uttered. It suggests a departure that was not only unplanned, but instantaneous and involuntary. He was there one moment, and gone the next. Rudy continued his solemn exploration, moving towards the last unopened door, which led to the bathroom. Here, the sense of a morning routine abruptly halted was even more potent. The room was small, with dated blue and white tiles. On the edge of the sink, a toothbrush rested in a ceramic holder, its bristles dry but with a faint, chalky residue of toothpaste. Beside it, a can of Barbasol shaving cream and a safety razor sat on a small rust-colored stain on the porcelain, a ghost of water that evaporated 37 years ago. He opened the mirrored medicine cabinet. The click of the magnetic latch was sharp in the silence. Inside was a testament to the brands of 1983. A bottle of high karate aftershave, a stick of Menon Speed Stick deodorant, a bottle of aspirin. Everything was neatly arranged, nothing out of place. It was another piece of the puzzle that did not fit. If something had happened to Arthur in the apartment, one would expect signs of a struggle, of chaos. A knocked-over lamp, a disheveled room. But there was nothing. The scene was perfectly, terrifyingly normal. It was the pristine nature of the apartment that was so abnormal. Returning to the living room, Rudy's attention was now drawn to the details that might tell him more about the man himself, not just his habits. Who was Arthur Harrison when he was not being a meticulous bookkeeper? A small bookshelf next to the inert television offered some clues. The collection was eclectic. There were several classic science fiction novels by authors like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. Next to them were dense history books about ancient Rome and the American Civil War. And then, a series of paperback thrillers, spy novels by Robert Ludlum and John le Carre. It was the library of a curious mind, one that liked to escape into worlds of logic, history, and intrigue. Tucked away at the end of the shelf was a record player. It was a simple turntable, its plastic dust cover so thick with grime it was almost opaque. Rudy lifted the cover, revealing a record already on the platter. It was a classical album, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos. It seemed to fit the persona of the quiet, orderly bookkeeper. But as he looked at the small collection of vinyl records stored in a crate on the floor, another side of Arthur emerged. Alongside more classical music were albums by Kraftwerk, the German pioneers of electronic music, and Brian Eno's ambient masterpiece, Music for Airports. This was not just the music of a quiet man. It was the music of a man interested in structure, in patterns, but also in the future, in new and evolving soundscapes. The final piece of this initial exploration was a small wooden desk tucked into a corner of the living room. This was clearly Arthur's personal command center. A bulky 10-digit calculator sat next to a cup filled with precisely sharpened pencils.
A large ledger book clé open.
The columns were filled with tiny, perfect numbers, a record of his personal finances. Everything was accounted for, down to the penny. But it was a stack of papers held together by a binder clip that revealed the most significant clue since the wallet and keys. They were bank statements from the Northern Trust Company, dating from 1981 through 1983. Rudy carefully leafed through them. They told a story of fiscal responsibility. Every month, a portion of Arthur's paycheck was deposited. Every month, a check was written to the building management for rent, long before he prepaid the full amount. His spending was minimal. Small checks for utilities, groceries, the occasional bookstore. It was the picture of a man saving diligently, living well within his means. Until the very last statement.
The one for September of 1983.
It showed all the usual activity, but with one glaring exception. On September 28th, just 2 weeks before he disappeared, there was a single massive deposit.
$52,000.
In 1983, that was a fortune. It was more than his annual salary. There was no memo, no indication of its source. It was just a number, a huge, unexplained anomaly in an otherwise perfectly predictable financial life. The mystery of Arthur Harrison was no longer just about where he went. It was now tied to a secret fortune he had suddenly acquired just before he vanished. The $50,000 question. Where did an ordinary bookkeeper in 1983 get that kind of money? It was a sum that could change a life. It could buy a house, start a business, or fund a new identity. It was also the kind of money that could attract the wrong kind of attention. This single entry in a dusty bank statement transformed the narrative from a simple, sad case of a man gone missing into a potential thriller, echoing the plots of the spy novels on his bookshelf. Rudy carefully placed the bank statements back on the desk, his mind racing. He had to report this. The police needed to be involved again. A 37-year-old cold case was suddenly, undeniably hot. But before he left, he felt an obligation to complete his survey of the apartment. He had seen the public spaces, the bedroom, the bathroom. He had seen Arthur's finances and his tastes in music and literature. But was there anything more personal? Anything that spoke of family, of friends, of a life connected to others? He began to search more deliberately for photographs. In a home filled with such order, there were surprisingly few. There were no smiling family portraits on the walls, no snapshots tucked into picture frames. It was as if Arthur was a man without a past, or one who chose not to display it. Finally, in the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of old tax returns, he found a small plain cardboard box. He lifted the lid. Inside was not a collection of memories, but a small curated archive. There were only 3 photographs. The first was an old black and white picture of a man and a woman, presumably his parents, standing stiffly in front of a small, modest house. They were not smiling. The second was a high school yearbook photo of a young Arthur, his face unformed, his expression serious even then. And the third was different. It was a faded color photograph, a candid shot. Arthur was in it, but he was younger, perhaps in his late 20s. He was sitting at a picnic table, and he was laughing. It was a genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind of expression entirely absent from his other photos. Next to him, a young woman with long dark hair was smiling at him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. On the back of the photo, a single word was written in neat, cursive handwriting, Eleanor. Alongside the photos was a small bundle of letters, tied together with a simple string. They were from Eleanor. Rudy did not read them all, it felt too invasive, but he glanced at the dates. They were from the early 1970s, a full decade before his disappearance. The salutations were warm, affectionate. They spoke of shared jokes, of movies seen, of plans for the future. And then, in the last letter of the bundle, the tone changed. It was more formal, more distant. It spoke of different paths, of difficult choices. It was a goodbye letter. This small box offered the only glimpse of a deeper emotional life. A life that had once included love and laughter, and then profound loss. It painted a picture of a man who, after a significant heartbreak, may have retreated into a world he could control. A world of order, of books, of quiet routines. A world where emotions could be neatly filed away, just like his financial records. His meticulous nature was not just a personality trait, it was a defense mechanism. A fortress he had built around himself. Now, all the pieces were on the table.
Acquiet, orderlyman. A pastert break.
A sudden, unexplained windfall of cash. And a disappearance so abrupt that he left his keys and wallet behind. The theories began to spiral. Did his old love, Eleanor, suddenly reappear? Did the money come from her, a settlement or an inheritance? Or was the source of the money far more sinister? Could Arthur, the quiet bookkeeper, have stumbled upon something at his job? Financial irregularities, a hidden ledger, a crime he was not meant to see. In his world of numbers, he would have been uniquely positioned to spot an anomaly. Perhaps he tried to do the right thing, or perhaps he tried to leverage his discovery for his own gain, leading to the $50,000 deposit. This was no longer just about preserving a time capsule. The apartment had become a crime scene, frozen for 37 years. Every object was a clue. The dust was evidence. The silence was a witness. Rudy took out his phone, stepped back into the hallway, and pulled the door to apartment 4B shut. The click of the latch echoed again, but this time it felt different. It was not sealing a memory away. It was preserving a mystery for the authorities who were about to arrive, hoping to finally answer the question that had hung in the air since October 12, 1983. What happened to Arthur Harrison?